During the medieval period, warfare was brutal, often resulting in long, drawn-out sieges that caused immense suffering. The siege warfare of the Middle Ages was a terrifying spectacle that involved starving cities into submission, battering down walls with siege engines, and engaging in bloody battles. But behind these military tactics, there existed a hidden cruelty that affected not only soldiers, but also the innocent civilians trapped inside the besieged towns and castles, particularly pregnant women. At the center of medieval warfare were the knights' highly trained warriors who were bound by chivalric codes which promised them honor and protection of the weak. However, these codes were often ignored during times of war. Siege warfare presented knights with the ultimate test of morality. It was a brutal time where the most sacred of oaths were disregarded, and the rules of war became far more savage. Pregnant women, along with other civilians, found themselves particularly vulnerable, as sieges often turned into desperate situations where the lines between honor and savagery became blurred. Sieges during the Middle Ages often lasted for months, sometimes even years, as attackers surrounded cities and cut off all supplies. The goal was simple: starve the enemy into submission. However, this created a living nightmare for those trapped inside. Food and clean water became scarce, and the stress of living under constant threat of violence wore down the spirits of the defenders. It was in these conditions that pregnant women found themselves in the most horrific circumstances. Pregnant women, as helpless and vulnerable as they were, became prime victims during these sieges. While knights were expected to uphold a certain code of honor when they faced the hardships of war, this often gave way to brutality. Pregnant women, along with children, elderly, and other civilians, were often subjected to horrors that went beyond the conventional warfare of the time. Many knights, driven by hunger, fear, and a desire for revenge, took part in acts of violence that were not only cruel, but also unthinkably cruel toward pregnant women. As the attackers attempted to breach the gates and walls of the cities, they often did not stop at soldiers and warriors. The knights and the soldiers attacked with ruthless abandon. Women were often captured, tortured, and subjected to barbaric treatment. In medieval sieges, there was no guarantee of safety for pregnant women. Once captured, they were often subjected to horrific fates. Some were taken as prisoners of war, forced to march across difficult terrain, subjected to harsh conditions, and left in overcrowded cells where food and water were nearly impossible to come by. Others, if they survived the siege, were sometimes brutally raped or mutilated by the conquering knights, who showed no regard for their condition. For those who were pregnant, the suffering was far worse, as pregnancy often made them vulnerable to attacks. Their bodies, weakened from starvation, the stress of the siege, and the trauma of the attacks, could not withstand the abuse they were forced to endure. The knights were supposed to be protectors of women, children, and the weak, according to their chivalric codes. But these codes were often thrown aside during the heat of battle. For some, the war became an excuse to indulge in their basest instincts. Pregnant women were not only captured but often tortured as part of psychological warfare meant to break the spirit of the defenders. Horrific acts were carried out to terrorize the people inside the walls, and pregnant women, who were symbols of life and hope, became a target for the knights and their men. The violence directed at them was not just physical but deeply psychological, meant to strip them of dignity and crush the morale of the defenders. This brutality went beyond just the immediate physical harm. For many, the suffering was a prolonged one. Pregnant women were often forced to witness the destruction of their families, the death of loved ones, and the total collapse of their homes. The mental toll on these women was unbearable. They were forced to endure psychological terror, watching as their entire world came crashing down, while they themselves faced unspeakable violence. It was in these conditions that pregnant women faced a unique kind of war, one where their bodies, their lives, and their futures were entirely at the mercy of the warriors and knights who laid siege to their cities. Their treatment reflected the dark underbelly of medieval warfare, where no one was truly safe, and where honor was often abandoned in favor of terror and brutality. As the long, brutal sieges raged on, the knights who had once sworn to uphold the honor of their code were increasingly abandoning any semblance of chivalric duty. The realities of war pushed these men to commit unspeakable atrocities, particularly against the most vulnerable members of society, pregnant women. The impact of such violence went beyond the physical harm inflicted, seeping into the psychological realm, affecting both the women caught in the raids and the communities they left behind. The pregnant women who survived the initial onslaught of a medieval siege often faced a life far worse than death. When cities and villages were overrun, women especially, those with children or pregnant were left with no choice but to surrender or suffer even worse fates. The knights, now emboldened by the collapse of the city's defenses, would often take prisoners, but these captives were far from receiving mercy. Pregnant women in particular were subject to unimaginable cruelty. They were taken captive by the knights, forced to endure rough marshes, and subjected to inhumane conditions. Starvation, exposure to the elements, and the constant threat of abuse were all part of their suffering. The stress of their situation only exacerbated the difficulties of pregnancy, leading to miscarriages and premature births. These women were often forced to give birth in the middle of battlefields, without the assistance of medical care, surrounded by chaos, death, and violence. One of the most horrific aspects of these sieges was the rape of women, a fate that pregnant women were tragically not exempt from. Knights, driven by their own thirst for power and dominance, would sometimes violate the pregnant women they captured. The act was not only one of sexual violence but also an attempt to strip these women of their dignity and to psychologically crush the spirit of the defenders. The humiliation of being raped while pregnant and in full view of their families was a power move, a way of showing utter contempt for the weakest members of society. Pregnant women who were captured in such a way suffered not only the physical pain of rape, but also the emotional toll of having their bodies violated while they were already carrying the most vulnerable life within them. The agony and trauma these women endured were compounded by the trauma of knowing they had no protection from their attackers. There was no escape, no safe place, and the brutality they faced would haunt them long after the sieges ended. The mental toll on these women was profound. To be pregnant in such dire circumstances was a torment in itself. They were constantly reminded of their vulnerability, their helplessness in the face of the violent forces around them. Some women were forced to witness the slaughter of their families, their homes burned to the ground, their husbands, sons, and fathers killed before their eyes. In the midst of such chaos and death, they were left to mourn the destruction of their lives, often left alone with nothing but their pain and fear. For those women who gave birth during the sieges, the danger to their babies was undeniable. With no shelter, no food, and no medical assistance, the birth of a child in these conditions often led to either death in labor or immediate death after birth. Infanticide during sieges was not uncommon, as starving mothers were sometimes forced to make the agonizing decision to kill their newborns to save them from the torture of a painful, hungry death. The desperation of these women, who had no means of support, became one of the darkest aspects of medieval warfare. The actions of the knights during these sieges were not limited to the capture of women. Some women were tortured, used as pawns in the psychological warfare of the knights. They were paraded in front of the defenders, forced to beg for their lives or the lives of their children, all for the purpose of humiliating and weakening the resolve of the besieged. In some instances, the pregnant women who were captured were beheaded, their bodies mutilated and displayed to instill further terror among their people. For the knights themselves, these acts were often performed without remorse. The concept of mercy was often discarded in favor of intimidation, fear, and control. The men who carried out these barbaric acts were products of a society that valued conquest and dominance above all else. They justified their actions under the guise of war, seeing their victims as mere objects of subjugation, rather than human beings with rights, dignity, or worth. In the aftermath of the sieges, the women who survived faced the grief of loss, the trauma of violence, and the constant reminder of what they endured. Those who managed to escape the siege, often carrying the emotional scars of what they had been through, faced an uncertain future. They had no homes, no families, and often no means of support. Many were left to roam the wilderness, unable to find refuge or rebuild what they had lost. The brutality inflicted on pregnant women during these medieval sieges serves as a dark reminder of the violence of war and the ways in which it exploits the most vulnerable members of society. It was not just the physical violence, but the psychological terror that these women endured that left a lasting impact on their families and communities. The warriors who once swore an oath to protect women and children had become the very instruments of their destruction.